Hello and welcome to Context. I'm Bakhtiyar Hasanov. Moscow is preparing for its annual Victory Day parade, commemorating 80 years since the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazi Germany. But the backdrop is dramatically different from years past. As Russia aims to project power, pride and permanence on this National Day of Triumph, it's reeling from a large-scale Ukrainian drone assault that has disrupted air traffic nationwide and stranded tens of thousands of passengers. Victory Day has long stood at the core of Russia's national identity, both as a sacred historical memory and more recently as a symbol of Moscow's ongoing confrontation with the West. With Chinese President Xi Jinping on a 4-day state visit, this year's commemorations are a strategic display of international alignment as well. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan will attend the event, but Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev has declined to attend. Today on Context, we explore what does Russia hope to achieve with this year's Victory Day optics. Has Ukraine's drone campaign disrupted Moscow's image of invincibility? And why is Azerbaijan distancing itself from the ceremony? To help us break all this down, we are joined by Matthew Bryce, a former U.S. diplomat joining us from Istanbul, Turkey, and Shujait Ahmadzadeh, independent researcher joining us from Baku. Thank you for both of you for joining us. It's great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Mr. Hasanov. Really happy to be with you.
Mr. Bryce, how central is Victory Day to Russia's national narrative, especially in wartime?
Well, your question is the answer. It is absolutely central to the Russian historical myth. The victory over Nazi Germany in World War II is the most powerful motivating factor, I think, not only from President Putin's perspective toward all of Russian society, but it was true for his predecessor as well, for Boris Yeltsin. I served in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow during 1995 to 97, and yeah, that Victory Day parade was absolutely the highlight of the geopolitical year for Russia. And as you said, Mr. Hasanov, now, in wartime, during a war that President Putin chose to launch against Ukraine and which is not going well for him, with him not even coming close to achieving his strategic goal, which is to basically disarm Ukraine and make it impossible to operate as an independent state. Memories then of the great all the Soviet nationalities' victories against Nazi Germany is even more important as a way to provide positive energy, I think, to the citizens of Russia.
So, Mr. Ahmadzadeh, this year, what image is Russia trying to project to both domestic and international audiences?
Yeah, it's a very relevant question because what we're seeing in the Ukraine front is that Russia still not achieved a political victory that President Putin was telling to his people, despite a very high cost of this war to the Russian populace at large. This means that this year's parade is also imagined as sort of a modern Russian nation building, in a sense that Russia is portrayed, quote unquote, as continuity of the Soviet regime in a form of fighting with the global Nazi forces, of course in quotation marks. This is primarily done with the goal of ethno-political mobilization, so this ongoing stalled war in Ukraine could be supported by the large masses of society. And what we know here is that there is increased war fatigue in Russia, especially with regards to the high casualties related to this war. With this in mind, there needs to be a sort of a new nation-building model for Russia that would also exploit the memory of the Great Patriotic War of 1945 to 1945 to use it for the modern-day geopolitical purposes, most primarily to mobilize mass support for the war in Ukraine, for its continuation.
So, Mr. Bryce, have the recent Ukrainian drone strikes, especially those that disrupted air travel, damaged Russia's narrative of control and security?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that was a beautiful explanation just now of the importance of this parade for building the Russian population's will to continue this terrible war. And yeah, I think that the Ukrainian drone strikes, first of all, we know they frightened residents even of Moscow in the past who had felt that they were far removed from the actual fighting and therefore could kind of put the war and its horrible costs, by the way, costs not only to Ukrainians, but of course to Russians, with the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who have been killed and are being killed. Now the war is being brought to Russian people and Russian civilians. And the fact that, there could be disruption of air traffic in Russia, especially on this day, that is extremely embarrassing to President Putin, and then undermines the narrative that we've been talking about of how Russia has the Soviet Union had an invincible military, defeated the Nazis, and that the Russian army is the modern day incarnation or reincarnation of that Soviet military, and that victory over Ukraine is inevitable, when in effect Russia is, again, nowhere near achieving its strategic goals against Ukraine, and is now coming under drone strike attacks by Ukraine on Russian territory.
So, Mr. Braza, how does Xi Jinping's visit play into the optics Moscow seeks to convey?
Well, on the one hand, it plays right into the optic that Russia is standing for some sort of fundamental values, I guess, of resistance to the capitalist West, embodied by the United States and its European allies, and that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are building an alternative way to organize international relations, and they're strong and they're unified, and this is another sign of Vladimir Putin's diplomatic success, just as the war against, as we were saying in quotes, the Nazi regime in Kiev is also going to be a success for Russia. In reality, however, it's clear that Xi Jinping and China are not in favor of this war. And when President Putin had been threatening a year and a half ago or so, possibly to use nuclear weapons, there are lots of reports that Xi Jinping said, do not do that. That's bad for all of us. And also, if you think back to about the same time, a year and a half ago or so, when China put out its own settlement plan for Russia's war in Ukraine, one of the key, or the top element of that plan was to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, since that's what China wants to do with respect to Taiwan. So there's a lot of tension in the Xi Jinping-Vladimir Putin relationship, no matter how many times they both claim that they formed a strategic partnership with no limits. So the Xi Jinping participation cuts in two directions.
So, Mr. Ahmadzadeh, Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev is notably absent from this year's celebrations. What role did the Azal airliner crash and subsequent cyber attacks on Azerbaijani media play in Baku's decision to skip the event?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think it played a role, because what we see now is there is, let's say, very substantive dissatisfaction on Baku's end towards Moscow for a number of actions. The first and foremost is that despite it's been now 5 or 6 months, Russia still didn't take any legal action to satisfy Azerbaijani demands when it comes to the aircraft tragedy that happened with the participation of the Russian air defense forces. Then later on, it not only ended there, but continued in the form of, as you rightly mentioned, cyber attacks, which were massive in terms of their capacity and targets, and basically covered most of Azerbaijani media landscape. And it continued also in the form of other small or mid-level hybrid warfare means, which definitely has its repercussions in terms of how Baku calculates its relation with Russia. I think one of the biggest difference here is that Russia and Azerbaijan are on different ends in terms of conceptualizing how they see themselves, each other. For Azerbaijan, Russia for many years were three Russias. One was neighbor, the other one was a mediator, the other one was a hegemon. But mediator is not the case anymore. Hegemon, and Azerbaijan increased its agency, trying to make sure that Russia sees it as an equal partner. I think that change in the perception and the concepts are not quite, let's say, well received in Russia back in Moscow. That's why they don't really digest this drastic change in terms of how Russia is perceived in Azerbaijan.
Mr. Ahmadzadeh, can you also explain the diplomatic incident involving Azerbaijani Member of Parliament Azer Badamov and why it was so significant for Azerbaijani-Russian relations?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's significant for a number of reasons. The first, this incident happened because he was invited to Russia by Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs or state authorities. Then later on, Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs stood silent, which is also means sort of endorsement. I mean, being complicit in this diplomatic warfare, and I would call it diplomatic warfare because I mean, warfare in diplomacy do not happen by just two foreign ministers telling some bad words against each other. It also happens in this form. It means that a representative of Azerbaijani state, in one form or another, is banned to enter the Russian Federation, which Russia considers as its good friendly neighbor. It's also kind of good manifestation of how Azerbaijani, let's say, demands from Russia, which are kind of well-grounded because the tragedy happened, and this happened because Russian air defense forces literally fired a missile to civilian airplane, are received still in a form that a small state, Azerbaijan, cannot demand these rightful things. I think also it taps into the what existing new colonial state making and vision in Moscow when it comes to its neighbors, specifically to Azerbaijan.
So, Mr. Breizer, under what conditions do you think President Ilham Aliyev would have attended the parade?
I think if the Russian side, as Mr. Ahmadzadeh was saying, had conducted a real investigation and identified who was guilty, or even if President Putin had made a sincere and genuine apology, what President Putin has said, right, after the December 25th downing of the Azov flight was, I'm sorry that this occurred in Russian airspace. That's ignoring all responsibility, and it's not sincerely feeling sympathy. So I having worked a lot with President Aliyev, I think that human touch goes a long way, and if in the South Caucasus and in the neighboring areas, if that amount of respect is not shown to the country and the citizens of a country that have suffered such a terrible tragedy, for which you were responsible, and you don't express sincere sympathy, it's really difficult then to carry on with diplomacy as usual. And then all the knock-on effects that Mr. Ahmadzadeh was just talking about happen, whereby Azerbaijan starts to view Russia in a different way, no longer as a hegemon or as even a reliable partner, certainly not as a mediator, and then relations can unravel. So I think, just to answer your question again, had there been a sincere apology and some real investigation into who was responsible for the downing of the Azov flight, I think President Aliyev would then be ready to have normal relations with his Russian counterpart.
Mr. Breizer, Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan will attend the parade. Does Pashinyan's attendance risk alienating the West, given his government's recent moves toward EU integration?
Well, it will certainly upset some people in the European Union who are trying to increase the isolation of Russia, both diplomatically and economically. It's only in recent days we've seen the European Commission announcing finally its plans to eliminate all Russian oil and natural gas imports into the European Union by 2027. So the European Union is tightening its approach to Russia and its sanctions against Russia. When it comes to the United States, it's unclear what the Trump administration's approach to Russia is going to be. And so if Prime Minister Pashinyan attends the parade, I think many people in the Trump administration will say, well, so be it. I mean, we were maybe going to send a high-level representative to the parade as well. And now we're trying to put pressure on Russia to negotiate in good faith to end its war in Ukraine. So the Trump administration's bouncing forward and backward in terms of pressuring Russia. But the European Union is trying to increase its pressure on Russia precisely when the United States is maybe softening its approaches to Russia. But at the end of the day, I think that the European Union as an organization, not talking about any individual member state, but as an organization, it recognizes that Prime Minister Pashinyan is trying to finalize the peace treaty with Azerbaijan, and that he does face very serious political opposition by those forces who fought against me as well in Armenia and in the United States, who benefit from conflict with Azerbaijan and don't want to see the war end.
Mr. Ahmadzadeh, Azerbaijan has just signed a strategic partnership with Vietnam. Is this a signal of broader eastward diversification or something more transactional?
mean, certainly, I wouldn't say this is something that happened overnight because ever since the war in Georgia back in 2008, and after the subsequent geopolitical change in the Eastern European domain, Azerbaijan chose the path of a very interesting combination of a multi-alignment with non-alignment, so mix of these two sort of oxymoron concepts at the same time, which in itself meant rather new chapters for Azerbaijani foreign policy making to be opened. It is included back at a time like a decade ago membership of non-aligned movement. Later on, it continued with Azerbaijan trying to institutionalize this framework. So a lot of new chapters for cooperation opened thanks to this movement, actually, not an organization. And I think the relation with Vietnam is also part of it. That's why there are Azerbaijani thinking that Azerbaijan should be more active in its foreign policy making, also in its relation with the non-Western countries. It wouldn't bring a huge geoeconomic change because Azerbaijan economy at the end of the day is part of a wider European economic space, despite Azerbaijan being not a member of the EU and not having such a desire to become anytime soon. Though diplomatically, these interactions do show, especially not only with Vietnam, but with China quite recently, with African countries quite recently, it shows an understanding that multi-vectoral foreign policy should be expanded.
So, Mr. Braiza, what's your opinion on this question?
I very much agree with Mr. Ahmadizadeh. Azerbaijan has secured its physical and economic connectivity with Europe through the various pipeline projects, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, South Caucasus Gas Pipeline, now TANAP, and TAP, and the whole southern corridor. So that gives Azerbaijan then, how to put it, some oxygen of independence that it can then use to have a multi-vector foreign policy. And that's the wise thing to do. You know, Azerbaijan is the only country in the world, as we all know, that shares borders with both Russia and Iran. It's also still technically in a state of war with one of its neighbors, with Armenia. And to the east, there's China, there's Central Asia, there's so much opportunity. And as the longtime leader, I think for 5 years, Azerbaijan led the non-aligned movement. It made a lot of friends in the so-called global south. Vietnam has a very large population and booming economy, and that is a valuable economic partner for Azerbaijan. So it makes every sense that to remain non-aligned, but still connected to Europe, Azerbaijan would develop its relations with Vietnam, just as Azerbaijan is talking about joining the BRICS.
So, Mr. Ahmadzadeh, looking forward, what kind of Russia-Azerbaijan relationship can we expect in the near term?
I think on Azerbaijani end, there is an interest in keeping relations on equal basis in a way that because Russia still acts as the primary non-oil market for Azerbaijan. So there is economic partnership. And there's also shared interest in terms of how regional security, with regards to specifically North Caucasus, this area should be safe and sound for the good of both countries, including Russia and Azerbaijan. There's also then the element of, as we know, a lot of Azerbaijanis living in Russia, either in the form of them getting Russian citizenship or still living there without getting citizenship, which plays an important role in Azerbaijani-Russian relations. These are the kind of bridges that exist between Azerbaijan and Russia. Though, on the other hand, I think with increased multipolarity and also the war in Ukraine going to, as Ambassador Braiza said it, nowhere to the point when Russia could get what it wants from this war, I think there is a possibility of increased, certainly performative, and to other degree, a bit of substantive episodical confrontations between Baku and Moscow, specifically if Moscow continues to see Azerbaijan as its backyard, in a sense that it is part of its wider sphere of influence, which it wants to dominate. I think these domination efforts will be kind of prevented by Azerbaijan by its, as we talked, by its multi-alignment with different countries, including Turkey and many others, and it's including economic independence that it secured through the wide gas and oil pipelines that it connects Azerbaijan with Europe.
Shujaat Ahmadzadeh, Matthew Bryza, thank you both for this insightful discussion. We truly appreciate your time.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of this edition of Context. A special thanks to our guests for their insights. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. Don't forget to follow Context for more in-depth analysis on the world's most pressing geopolitical issues.